All right, folks. So welcome back for for this next part. We're going to continue on learning about the different parts of the digestive system, and we got up to the small intestine. So in the stomach, we talked about the gastric juices mixing up with the bolus, turning it into this goopy, liquidy paste, and we call that chyme. And chyme is now going to enter the small intestine from the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter connects the stomach to the small intestine. Now, there's three different parts to it. So the pyloric sphincter is in this region over here. The first part is the duodenum or the duodenum, depending on where you are in the world. This ends up becoming this middle section here that has a whole bunch of folds and turns. We call that the jejunum, and the jejunum eventually turns into the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine. So we're going to work our way through that and try to understand what the small intestine is. Arguably, that might be the most crucial part of the digestive system. So another image here, if you want to see the whole digestive system, we start off at the mouth. As you can see, it comes all the way down into the stomach, and the stomach drops off into the small intestine, and then eventually we'll learn about the large intestine. We're also going to talk about some of these accessory glands that are here as well, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, but that'll come a little bit later on. So, small intestine itself, it's named because of its diameter. The small intestine is significantly smaller in diameter than the large intestine, but the small intestine is actually it's super long. It could just be called the long intestines instead because it's incredibly long. Essentially, if you were to unfold it and lay it out, for the average person, it's about 6 meters in length, which is pretty significant. Like 6 meters, I don't know what I can compare to that, but I'm just under 2 meters. No, I'm not just under. I'm significantly under 2 meters. I'm 178 centimeters tall. So that's 1.78 meters. So think of myself and then six of me stacked up on each other. The small intestine would be longer than that. The first couple of centimeters, we call this the duodenum or duodenum. And there's a couple of ducts that connect to the duodenum. So first of all, you're connecting from the stomach, but then there is a duct from the liver and a duct from the pancreas that also join up. We call the single duct that joins up the common bile duct. So there's a little bit of bile that comes from the liver, and then there's a little bit of pancreatic juice that comes from the pancreas through this duct. And the bile and the pancreatic juice are going to help us in this digestion process as well. The bile, its purpose is to emulsify the fat. Quite a long time ago, I explained to you that we have something that emulsifies fats in our body. Emulsifying is essentially converting a liquid into a form that we can absorb or digest that into water. So you can't mix oil and water unless you have an emulsifier there, and then you can do a little bit of mixing up into a slurry if necessary. The intestine is going to have a slightly basic pH, which sounds strange because it just got filled up from the stomach where there was a lot of HCl, which is acidic, right? The reason for this is your pancreatic juice contains sodium bicarbonate. It contains baking soda, essentially. And the baking soda is going to neutralize that acidity from the stomach. And that's important because you don't want acid into your duodenum. Otherwise, eventually, when it ends up in your anus, you can imagine acid coming out of you from that end. Probably not going to enjoy that so much. So, having this baking soda system in the pancreatic juice is useful to us because it neutralizes that acid. So it's a chemical reaction. You don't need to know the chemical reaction because we're not doing biochemistry here. But in case you're wondering, you got sodium bicarbonate mixing with HCl turns into salt, which is NaCl. So your body produces its own salt, and it also produces water and carbon dioxide. Additional enzymes in the pancreatic juice and enzymes that are produced by your intestines, they're going to help us finish this whole process of digestion. So inside your small intestine, you're going to see these little folds. We mentioned them a long time ago when we talked about individual cells, but these are larger folds. These are called villi, and the villi are just a whole bunch of extra fingers that protrude from the walls of the small intestine, and that increases the surface area. So if I just have a long tube, I just have the inner surface area of that tube. But if I have a whole bunch of fingers inside of that tube, I can stretch out the total surface area of my small intestine to approximately the size of a tennis court. And that's not an exaggeration. That's a huge surface area that we get from the small intestine. And that's important to us because this is going to help us um, absorb the nutrition that we want to get from the food, because we spent all this time and energy breaking it down. Now we have to get those pieces out. So those projections that we have, those fingers are called villi, and they cover the small intestine. They sway back and forth to push that food along its digestive tract. And if you look at one individual villus, so singular for villi is villus, if you look at a single one and you look into it on a microscope, you notice this finger has its own fingers on top of it. So imagine a finger with a whole bunch of fingers attached to it. That's what a villus is, and we call those microvilli. So that gives us an insane amount of surface area, and it gives us this brush-like pattern, so it's much easier to trap and collect the nutrients that we want to grab. Microvilli are very similar to cilia that we talked about quite a while ago. Now the microvilli, they're going to have the intestinal enzymes, and these enzymes are called brush border enzymes, and their whole purpose is to increase the surface area and to help us with the reabsorption as not the reabsorption, but just the regular absorption of food as it crosses through the small intestine. Remember, the food had become a bolus, then it had become chyme, and that's what we have right now is chyme slurping through our small intestines. The nutrients are absorbed into the vessels of a single villus. Okay, so we need to see it here in the top left corner. We have the small intestine. If we zoom in on just one teeny piece of it, you can see that there are villi. These are these finger-like projections. And if you look really careful, you can see these fingers upon that finger, and we call those microvilli. So if we take a look at that in a larger scale image, you can see that one villus looks like this. You have all these fingers that attach to it. Inside, you have this structure called the lacteal, which we'll look at later on when we learn about the lymphatic system. You'll also realize that there's a blood network that covers that lacteal as well. So each of those villi or each villus has its own blood supply as well. And then there's a couple of additional cells that are along the lining here to help us out, producing various enzymes and other chemicals that are going to help us in the digestive process. Quite often, a lot of it is mucus to make sure things are slimy on the inside so they slip through. Okay, so there's lots and lots of different things that you can see there. I am on top of a picture here if you really want to see. It's just a single villus, and it shows you the lymphatic and the blood network that goes around it, and then a couple of nerves that are in that area as well to innervate the lacteal. So villus contains blood capillaries and a small lymphatic capillary called the lacteal. As mentioned, we're going to look at those later on in the course. Lymphatic system is very similar to the cardiovascular system, so their systems are going to work very well together. All the sugars and amino acids that our blood is going to absorb are going to happen through one of these villi, so through the villus. And then glycerols and fatty acids, so components that come from our fats, those are going to enter the cells of the villi, and within those cells, they're going to be packaged as droplets, which can then enter the lacteal. So they're going to enter cells, and then we talked about how cells can transport materials. They're going to help us make lipoproteins, so fat proteins, and then those can enter the lacteal. So they're being packaged to be sent off to different places where we can use them later on. Once the nutrients are absorbed, they're eventually carried to the cells of the body through the bloodstream. So that's why it's important to have that blood network through our villi/microvilli, because as soon as we package everything, we can dump it onto our transport system, which is our blood, and then the transport system is going to take it to the various cells that can actually use these materials later on. So talking about digestive secretions, I mentioned a couple of them, and you might have noticed there's quite a lot of them, and it builds up over time. The digestive juices, they're controlled by the nervous system and a couple of hormones, your endocrine system as well. Hormone is a very specific, a very special type of substance. It's a chemical, and it's produced by certain cells that affect a different set of cells. We call them target cells. It sounds kind of odd, right? A chemical to react on a chemical. Why not just make the chemical you wanted in the beginning? It's a fail-safe, though. It's so that your body can produce chemicals after a stimulus as opposed to overreacting to certain stimuli. So hormones are usually produced by glands, and then they're transported by the bloodstream. An example of that is if a person has a food that has a lot of protein in it, your stomach is going to produce this hormone called gastrin. Gastrin is going to enter the bloodstream, and as soon as the stomach starts churning and the secretory activity of the gastric glands are getting ready for that meat to get there, the gastrin is going to help the gastric The gastrin is going to help the gastric glands increase their production of acids. A hormone, it enters into the digestive tract through the duodenal wall. We call it GIP for the gastric inhibitory peptide. This works to oppose gastrin and inhibits the gastrin gland secretion. So that's going to pop in a little bit later on once the food has started to digest. So cells in the duodenal wall, they're going to produce a couple of other hormones that are kind of interesting to us. One of them is secretin, and one of them is CCK, cholecytokinin. And both these chemicals are going to help out the body by reacting to stimulate the production of other chemicals, just like most hormones do. So acids like HCl, which is in chyme, it's going to release secretin, and the partially digested protein and fat is going to stimulate the release of CCK. Soon after, these hormones are going to be into our bloodstream, and the pancreas is going to increase the input of pancreatic juice. So that's going to help with digesting food. And then the liver, as a response, is going to start to release bile so that we can break down foods even further, in particular emulsify those fats. That brings us to the large intestine. So after the small intestine, we get into this large diameter intestine. There's 3 parts to it, but there's a whole bunch of other sections to that large intestine as well. A couple of those are the cecum, colon, and rectum, and then the anal canal at the very end. But then we actually have the large intestine, which is this big worm-like structure that goes around all of your small intestine before it gets to that anal canal. The large intestine is going to help us absorb extra waters, extra salts, and a couple of vitamins, but the majority of those smaller nutrients had been absorbed by the small intestine already. It's also going to help us take care of those indigestible materials, things that we can't really work with. And it's going to hold them there at the anus until we're at a place where we can eliminate those from our bodies. So the first piece that we're going to look at is the cecum. This is right below the junction of the small intestine, and it's a blind end. We call it a blind end because it doesn't go anywhere. So the cecum is all the way down over here. It doesn't really go anywhere, but it's just a blockage so that when food enters there, it can't go the other way, which would be, it's good that it doesn't go the other way. Cecum has a small little worm-like projection. We call that the appendix, so it just hangs off the end there. We used to think the appendix was useless. It was a vestigial organ, but we learned that the appendix is actually a breeding ground for bacteria, which is very useful for the large intestine because we're going to want those bacteria helping us out to help us digest the food once it gets there. So it can also help with fighting various infections. The problem is the appendix is really small, and it's possible because it's on that blind end for food products, or at this point it's bits of chyme, to get stuck in the appendix. And when it gets there, it blocks it. When it blocks it, it gets inflamed and swollen. We call that appendicitis. If inflamed, the appendix will have to be removed before that content rises to a very high level. Once that happens, the appendix will burst, and that's a really bad situation. We call it peritonitis. And that's just a total general idea of an infection in the abdominal cavity, but you don't want your appendix bursting because now you have a hole in your digestive tract. And that's not good because that means everything on the inside can now get outside. Peritonitis, if you don't get it treated right away, it will kill you. It kind of makes sense. Your digestive tract has to go somewhere. You can't have an opening in. So here's your small intestine. You can see it's very thin. It enters into your large intestine. And right at the bottom of your large intestine, you have this appendix, and then this blind end is called the cecum. Now let's get into the colon itself. This is the large intestine. The first part is this part that goes upwards. We call this the ascending colon. It's on the right-hand side of your body. And then you have the transverse colon that goes across the top of your abdomen, and it goes from one side to the other. So your ascending colon goes up on your right side, and then the transverse colon takes it from the right side and transfers it to the left side. It transverses across your abdominal cavity. Then you have a descending colon. This brings the product back down, now on your left side of the body. And this goes into this transitional part of your colon called the sigmoid colon, or the sigmoid. And this enters the rectum right at the bottom. So there's your cecum, that's your blind end. The colon itself is your ascending, it comes up. Then there's your transverse, it goes across. And then there's your descending, it comes down. Once the food gets down to this point, it goes through the sigmoid colon to get back into an area for elimination, and then it enters your rectum, prepared for elimination from the digestive tract. A rectum, this is the last 20 centimeters of your digestive tract. Again, this varies depending on the size of your body, but it's approximately 20 centimeters. And it opens up at the anus, and that's where defecation can happen. Defecation is just the expulsion of feces. So that's when you use a toilet. When feces are forced into the rectum by peristalsis, you get this thing called a defecation reflex. Now, typically what's happening is this rectal wall is stretching, and this is going to send a nerve impulse through your spine right up to your brain, and that's going to cause your rectal muscles to contract, and that's going to cause your anal sphincters to relax. This is what should happen. Okay, so essentially what's happening, as soon as there's enough food in your rectum, your body is starting the process of pooping, like it's starting the process of defecation. Okay, so the food gets into your rectum, and that is going to send the signal up. That's going to send the signal down, and it's going to release that internal anal sphincter. Now, that doesn't necessarily happen, right? If people have to use the washroom, they usually wait until it's time to use the washroom a little bit later on. So they'll be able to hold it in, unless there's like an extreme situation, or if you're very underdeveloped, like an infant, for example. As soon as the food gets there, that's why babies always poop themselves, is because as soon as the food gets there, it gets into the rectum, it is ready to come out. But that's not necessarily the case. So ridding the body of indigestible remains is a way that the digestion is going to help us maintain homeostasis, because we can't store those products in our body so much. Don't worry, I'm going to go back to that point in just a second here, but I want to get through the colon here. Your feces, when they come out, are going to be mostly water and just about 25% solid. So other components are in there. You'll have things like bacteria and fiber is described as something that is indigestible, and then a couple of other materials that are in the solid portion. The bacteria is going to work on the indigestible material. It causes things like sulfur deposits. That is why feces end up having the smell they have. It also produces gases, and that's why quite often defecation is accompanied by gas production. There's also a breakdown of a chemical called bilirubin. Bilirubin is a product of hemoglobin. So as your blood cells get old, your blood has to be eliminated from your body as well. You keep producing new blood cells, which is good, but those old blood cells have to be removed from your body somehow. So when those old blood cells are broken down, they become bilirubin. Bilirubin ends up in your large intestine, and that's what gives the feces the color that it has. It's like this reddish brownish color. So it used to be believed that there's a couple of bacteria that live, uh, like E. coli, inside of your colon, but it shows that most of the bacteria in your colon, they die if there's oxygen. So you're not typically supposed to have oxygen in that part of your body. So not only do the bacteria break down this indigestible material, but they also produce some vitamins and molecules that can be absorbed and used in our body. So it's just, our colon is like it's an ecosystem, essentially. It's a place where organisms are living, bacteria are living. It's a symbiotic relationship. They're helping us by producing various components that we can use, but we're also giving them an environment that they can live in as well, and proliferate in. Now, we talked about the appendix earlier on. If you have your appendix removed, you don't have as many bacteria. That can be a problem. So you can get things like fecal transplants. They get the bacteria reinserted into your body if necessary. It's useful to have them there. That you do want them there. Now, there are a couple of negative things that can happen in your digestive tract. We talked about ulcers in your stomach, things like heartburn in your esophagus, and then issues with dental hygiene. Well, in your small and large intestine as well, you can have issues as well. In your large intestine, in particular in your colon, you can get the development of polyps, which are small growths, little bubbles that start to pop up in your colon. Now, they can be benign; they don't do anything, or they can be cancerous. They could be tumors, essentially, but they can be removed if necessarily through some sort of surgical process. We can get them cut out so that you don't have them there. So there's colon cancer detected in your body, but we know that it's in a polyp. All we have to do is remove that polyp from your colon, and you'll be cancer-free. Like, it's a very, very quick and easy process. Like, it's not easy. It'll be a difficult surgery, but at least we can get rid of that polyp, and you won't have the cancer anymore. You can find out that if you have extra fat in your diet, you're more likely to have colon cancer. You're more likely to have these polyps forming because the fat is sticky and it sticks to the inside of your colon, and it increases the likelihood of getting that inflammation, that bubbling happening. That dietary fat is going to increase bile secretion, and if you have too much intestinal bacteria converting bile salts into substances, that can eventually promote the growth of various cancers. If you have fiber in your diet, in digestible material, this should be able to inhibit some of that cancer growth because you're constantly scrubbing clean your colon as that fiber goes through. So dietary fiber is going to absorb extra water. It's going to add bulk, so it's going to make something fit more snug inside of that cavity, and then the bile salts that are facilitating the movement of substances will move through and clear up anything that might be there, essentially flattening out the polyps before they actually come up. You should also have regular elimination. You should be using the washroom on a regular basis so that you don't have stuff sitting inside of your colon. Because when you have stuff sitting there, that increases the likelihood of irritation and eventually leads to things like polyps or cancer growths happening as well. Now, a couple of situations that might arise. One complaint is diarrhea, and the other one is constipation if there is a colon issue. Diarrhea is typically an infection in the lower intestinal tract, and there's some nervous stimulation that involves diarrhea as well. In the case of infection, let's say you have food poisoning by eating food that you shouldn't have had. Not that you would know, but maybe you had some food poisoning. Your intestinal wall becomes irritated, and the peristalsis increases so that it can eliminate whatever's in there faster. So that will cause something like diarrhea happening. The water in this situation, because the food is moving so fast, is not going to be absorbed. And because it's not absorbed, you end up getting this very liquidy defecation happening, and that is diarrhea. So it gets rid of infectious materials. So when you have diarrhea randomly, it might be a good thing. It might be because your body recognizes something that shouldn't be there and is eliminating it. The problem is that you're losing a lot of water to do this as well. So you want to make sure that you hydrate yourself very soon afterwards, if possible. In the nervous system, however, if there's a nervous situation, you might have your nervous system stimulated to cause you to pump out whatever food was in your intestines at that point. That's just a nervous reaction. If you have a lot of diarrhea, that will lead to dehydration. So if you have it for a long time, you're not going to be able to keep up with the water demands that your body has, and that's also going to affect the salt concentration in your body. When that happens, the electrical inputs in your body are kind of messed up. And that's a big issue because your heart is controlled by those electrical impulses. So it's a very serious thing if it lasts for a longer time. And that's when you might need to get maybe an IV and some other additional support or medications to help you out. There's another one as well called constipation. Constipation is similar but different to diarrhea. It's the opposite. Their feces dry up, so there's not enough water content, and then they get stuck. And they can't get passed through the elimination system or the rectal system. So one reason is this comes back to that point we we're making before, how when feces get into your rectum, you should have that nervous impulse to go use the washroom, but we've developed the ability to prevent that from happening because we're social beings, and that's a problem because we're able to hold that into our body for longer. The issue is that you're holding it in your large intestine where water is reabsorbed. So if you hold it for too long, it gets too dry. And then if it gets too dry, you cannot pass feces anymore. So you need to make sure that as soon as you get that sensation that you should use the washroom, you should excuse yourself from whatever you're doing, even if it's not, even if it's like mildly inconvenient, just get up and go use the washroom. Because if you let it sit inside of your colon, you're increasing the odds of that constipation from happening. Now, if you're not too worried about dealing with constipation, let me introduce you to hemorrhoids. A couple of things that happen is if that food or that product stays in your colon too long, you are going to irritate parts of your sphincter. So you might get this blood vessel building up on the inside, or you might get one building up on the outside. It's like a really large pimple, but it's full of blood. And it might be on the inside of your rectum, inside of your anal canal, or it might be on the outside. And those are hemorrhoids. And those are awful situations because if you're trying to pass feces later on, the pain might be too much and will prevent you from being able to actually get that product out. It could be possible that the hemorrhoid will be ruptured, and now you've got an open wound that your waste products are passing over. So you're making yourself prone to infections as well. This all happens because you're holding in instead of going to use a washroom when that signal is there. We should theoretically be more like babies. As soon as you get that sensation, we should just go. But obviously, as social beings, we can't quite do that. At least, though, if you get that sensation, you should excuse yourself from whatever you're doing, whether it's work or school or something else, and go use the washroom. A couple of things that can help you out. Make sure you're drinking lots of water. You should stay hydrated on a regular basis. That's a common theme with homeostasis. And make sure you're getting a decent amount of dietary fiber. The water is going to prevent the feces from drying out, and the fiber is going to give you bulk so that your peristalsis can push more food product along until it gets built up into your rectum, and at that point, you can eliminate it. Some people will only eat a small amount. They only have a small amount in their rectum, and then they don't get the sensation as much as they would be able to. So when they do decide to go, not as much comes out because they don't have enough bulk there. So having more fiber will help you do that. If you don't have a lot of fiber, just have a bowl of raisin bran or something, and you'll realize almost immediately you'll have to go use the washroom because of that extra fiber in there. You have too much constipation for a long time, that is those hemorrhoids. You don't want those hemorrhoids forming in or around your anus because that could be an extremely horrible situation. You might have to get that surgically removed because the pain might be too much for you to ever be able to use a washroom again until those hemorrhoids pass. And that's going to bring us to the accessory glands, but we're not going to get into the accessory glands just yet. We've had quite a few notes going through the digestive system, so we've gone over the majority of the organ systems now. So we're going to pause here, and then in our third part, we'll take a look at the accessory glands and a couple of illnesses and diseases that come across with the digestive system. But until then, hope you guys are having a good one, and we'll see you in the next one.